Hello everyone and welcome to another stream. It's been a while since my last one, but I feel like it's just yesterday. Just kidding, I'm very awkward right now, but let's just get right into it. So, the point of this stream is that I want to talk with some of you viewers. So the way I'll be doing that is that I have a link set up, and that link is not public yet. I am thinking of inviting someone. If you would like to join, then write down in the YouTube chat why I should invite you, and then we can hop up and talk with me. And it doesn't have to be a specific topic. It can be militaristically about the Ukraine war. It could also be challenging my views, for example, my neutrality, and so on. If you have anything to say to me about my channel, the way I record my videos, the way I report on it, anything, then this is your chance to talk to me face to face. And if you disagree with any of my analysis, you can also come on here and tell me exactly why you disagree and what you think will happen. So, is anyone willing to join? You know what? I'll just drop all of that. I'll put the link in the stream chat. And if you want to join, you join. All right, anyone? Okay, until someone joins, let's start out with the questions I put at. Oh, someone joined. It is fine if you don't want to show a webcam. You can just join without. All right, we have 4 people. I'll just add everyone, and then we'll talk one by one. Hello, everyone. Hello. All right, so the first question, let me give an opener and then everyone can come with their thoughts. The first question is, who is winning? So who is currently winning this war? If we look at the map, we can see that the Russians are simply advancing on the whole front line, but at a very slow pace. So we cannot determine who's winning based on the territory, because it has simply been a stalemate for many months now, with barely any changes. The heaviest fighting is by Bakhmut, where we've seen the Russians spend 8 months to capture now 70% of the city. And we've seen the Ukrainians pull out some troops and strengthen the flanks to fight there. So essentially the Russians are advancing, but that doesn't determine who's winning the war. So I'll be classifying who's winning based on the world scene as a whole. And we can see from that the Russians are essentially building up these alliances and cooperations with other countries. China visited the past couple of days, where the Chinese and the Russians made a lot of new deals that essentially officially got rid of the EU from Russians' income reliance to now being completely reliant on China for all of the income that they previously had from Germany or Europe as a whole. And now they're trading in yuan instead of dollars. And they are willing to sell oil and all of that stuff that they sell to Africa and South America and the rest of the world for yuan or rubles, whichever those countries prefer. So now the Russians are heavily trading in yuan compared to the dollar. The dollar is essentially useless for the Russians now. And that shows that they are able to continue this war for a very long time. And because of that, we can determine that Russia is not going to lose because of the financial or the geographical situation. That means the only reason Russians will lose this war is if they lose militarily. So from that, I will say that Russia is not in a position where they will be losing this war anytime soon. On the contrary, Ukraine is completely reliant on the West. They have no say in anything unless the West gives them the ability to do anything. They have no weapons without the West, they have no money without the West, they have no development, and half of their population has run out of the country or is displaced within the country, and the final half is essentially in a lot of trouble where they are putting everything they can for the war effort. So Ukraine is in a much more hard position or difficult position than the Russians are currently. So we have these two guys. Hello, the author, David Applegate, and JRJER. What do you guys think of that?
Jobs will be forced back, but still, Europe will be carrying the water for Ukraine for at least maybe even 100 years. We don't know. We don't know how long it's going to take, but we know it's going to cost at least $1 trillion to rebuild Ukraine. So that's the West economically has lost the war. But militarily, I believe it'll come down to a stalemate. Eventually, Poland or some other country will cross the border and cause Russia to pause. Or China will say to Russia, enough's enough. As long as they have the momentum and they're slowly building allies, Russia can afford to take its time. But if the situation becomes too unstable, China will say enough's enough. We'll call it here. But I think the ultimate goal is just the Donbass. I don't think after Donbass and Crimea, anybody's going to gain anything more. It's just going to escalate the losses on both sides. So economically, Russia can lose, but militarily, Ukraine's already lost.
So essentially, what you're saying is that the Ukrainian war goal of returning Crimea and the Donbass is unattainable by the Ukrainians. And the Russians have had a massive economic hit because of the war, but militarily they haven't lost because they're able to defend the territory they have taken.
Yeah, but if they go too far, that will escalate the war, and then both sides will have too much to lose. It'll switch from a war of attrition, a World War II style war of attrition, which, as you know, if you want to go winners and losers, look at World War II. America militarily outright won without a question. But politically, Japan won most of their political goals. They destroyed the empires they set out to destroy. But let's say Japan had called peace at Hiroshima and America had accepted, like Roosevelt was pressured to end the war in 1944. This is what we're facing now. If Biden accepts a loss of a quarter of Ukraine, it's going to be better than Russia taking half of Ukraine, even though Russia and America will lose so much more. It'll go from $1 trillion to $2 trillion, and Russia will take a bigger economic hit.
So essentially, you're saying that we're currently in a place where both sides, if they continue this war, they will just lose too much compared
to lose.
Yeah, there's just more to lose.
More to lose than they have to gain by keeping what they've got now.
But the thing is, according to Klaus von Clausewitz in his book on war, he says that essentially a peace comes when a peace deal is better than continuing the war. So essentially, we are not seeing any talks about peace. That is because both sides, or the Russians say they want peace. So that is because they see peace as having a better outlook than continuing the war. That is, if they are honest. They can also very much lie. And while the Ukrainians are refusing any possibility of a peace deal, which means that their outlooks are clearly much better by continuing the war than ending the war, I believe the reason for that is because the Ukrainians have already lost too much. They've lost too much. Economically, they are completely dependent. Yeah, they're completely dependent on the West. Population-wise, if the people do not return, they are absolutely, the worst position in the world because
no
they're
reason to return. Too poor. No reason to
so
return.
a peace for Ukraine.
Even on unemployment in Britain.
So a peace for Ukraine is
It's
essentially
twice what they're getting. Yeah.
If they want to get the best possible outcome, I believe a peace deal is still the way to go, because getting peace now is better than later, because then even though they're destroyed to the point that they cannot recover properly, at least within the next 50 to 100 years, it's still better to stop now than in another year where they have to take 200 or 300 or never exist again because of how much destruction there is in the country.
Yeah. And of course, the biggest issue they face is the fact that they may never see investment again from a lot of countries if they continue. Though the bloodier it gets, the messier it gets, and the higher the cost of rebuilding, the less likely they will see long-term investment.
Mm-hmm.
Because the cost of rebuilding, it'll be like will have to be shifted, right? And you look at the cost of rebuilding in Europe, the World War I and World War II debts took nearly 100 years to repay. And now that debt in Ukraine is almost at that point. But that's 50 countries carrying that debt. And I don't think they want to. That's where it's going to pull out. That it's not going to be Ukraine calling the shots. It'll be the mass protests in Paris will shift. Have you already seen the shift in the Netherlands? Did you see the Berlin protest? It's gone already from 100 to a few thousand. If that continues, that'll be the shift that the moderates don't want, because they'll lose the Greens and others in their coalition, and they will never hold power for another 100 years. They cannot afford it. But the only obstacle they have right now, and I think a lot of people don't want to acknowledge this, is the war industry is the one with the finger on the scale saying you continue this, because they did have a peace deal back in March. They were ready to give up the Donbass back in March. And the only thing that stopped them from giving up the Donbass was some idiot sticking his beak in from England saying, no, we'll give you 100 tanks because they're indestructible.
Yeah.
And what happened? 3 months after delivery, 3 months after the promise, they were delivered into Odessa. They were destroyed within 9 hours. 9 hours. They weren't even unloaded off the ship. They weren't even all they were all unloaded, but they weren't all on the trucks. Just 3 large missiles, set fire to the whole ammunition, cooked everything off, killed hundreds. Now, those are rare victories, but if Russia scores a few more of those, it won't matter how many tanks the West promises. They'll just keep firing missiles every 3 to 4 days until the West gives up.
So we have been joined by Bresciano Animation. Welcome. And do you have anything to say?
Well, actually, about the front in Ukraine, I want to see what the Chinese government will do, especially with the weapon. I want to like Russia, where they support both, so they stay. China
Sorry, your voice is getting
Israel
cut. I think there's a bad connection.
economical plan.
His frame rate dropped. I think he was saying something about the weapons. I'm not sure if he meant the Chinese weapons. Or, I think the Chinese are providing parts, not complete weapons.
Yeah.
I think it's the same with the Iranians. I think the Iranians are only providing parts.
I think something very interesting is that the West started talking about Chinese supply of ammunition. When they started talking about the Iranians supplying the drones, they actually talked about it a couple of months before we started seeing them on the field. So I believe that there could be some merit, because it seems that although there is a delay, the Western information about these deliveries usually turn out to be true. And that is most likely because they have a lot of spies everywhere in the Eastern countries that they're challenging economically and politically on the world stage.
Yeah.
So I believe that there could be some merit in that saying. And considering that the Russians bought weapons from Iran, then there's no reason to think that they wouldn't want to buy from China, who have also developed very well technologically advanced weapons, as well as heavy firepower weapons that the Russians are already using. At the same time, they have very tight connections and diplomatic ties with each other. So the only reason why I believe we haven't seen Chinese weapons in Ukraine already is because the Chinese don't want to get sanctions by the West. They want to avoid that economic troubles with the West.
Yeah. And another thing is, I think a lot of the ammunition is buyback. We sold, like Russia sold China, I think over the last couple of years, 122s and 253 heavy artillery based on the T-80 chassis, mobile artillery. So I think that's a lot of that ammunition is going to be buyback of old ammunition not currently used by the Chinese. Same with Iran. I think a lot of it is drone parts and buyback. Yes, there's some Iranian drones in there, but I think that's not relying on either side, because Russia wants to make a point that they could take on the West and hold their ground, which is a threat to the West, because if 50 countries can't be defeat Russia, and then Russia has China, Iran, and a couple of other countries on their side, and possibly that's an economic shift. The West can't risk losing further markets to the Chinese. So I think there's that political and economic pressure there. Just get enough ammunition to prolong the war, enough to put pressure on the West, not enough to tip the scale to an absolute victory. Because if the West panics, somebody will go nuclear.
Quickly, I want to thank Risbergu for the $5 donation. Thank you very much. And to what you were saying about the ammunition's just enough to continue the war, not enough to win. That is exactly what we were saying about Ukraine at the start of the war. The West sends just enough weapons for the war to continue, not enough for them to win. And it seems to continue in this way. Both sides have an interest in stopping this war, but both sides also have an interest in continuing this war, because there's something to win on both ends. As long as they just tip the scale slightly in their favor for them to actually come out on top in the end, that's what they both are aiming for. So the Russians or the Chinese want Russia to win, but just barely. And the West wants Ukraine to win, but just barely. So any sudden takeover of a part of Ukraine for either side is now entirely off the table, because the diplomatic situation or the military situation resulting from that would be a terrible loss for the whole world, because, as you said, anything right now could tip the scale into nuclear favor. And that is based on what the world politicians are saying. I believe it was Peskov or someone else on the Russian high staff who said that every weapons delivery is a small step closer to nuclear war. And I don't believe he's joking. I believe that is reality. As soon enough, they will send fighter jets. They're already sending MiGs and...
They already put 2 B-52s in Italy.
Exactly. So they're sending fighter jets now. Soon they will... Oh, the only reason I believe they haven't sent Western fighter jets is because it takes many years for them to actually train with them. So if the war continues for another 4 to 5 years, then we'll most definitely see Western fighter jets in Ukraine. So we just see both sides escalating. Okay, Russia can't match the economic or military output of 50 countries in the West. So they'll just ask for help from China. China is essentially economically equivalent to half of Europe plus the United States, especially with the industry. The industry is insane. It is incomparable in the world. I believe the Chinese industry is actually producing more than all of NATO combined. So
the Chinese arms industry is only running at 50%, and the Russians are running at 50%. They both can afford to step up production. Whereas, as you've seen with Europe for the last 50 years, they've been running at 100%, but they're 100% of that much compared to Russia. They've been relying on Western arms, and the Americans, their arms industry is in tatters. The 2008, a lot of cutbacks, 2012, 2016, they've all, it's not a very good position to be in if you're looking at $800 billion spent, and out of that, what have we got to show for it? 1,000 tanks, which won't last a year in Ukraine.
Honestly, what the West has been doing militarily sets huge question marks in my own mind, because the military capacity of the West, as was shown in World War II, is astronomical. Comparing that to what we see today, of course, World War II was a world war. Everyone put everything they had into the military industry. But still, today, we are not even seeing 10% of that. I don't even believe we're seeing 1% of that. Like, the Soviets had 50,000 tanks at some point, if not more.
They cut that back, but they reached a peak of more. They had outnumbered the West 5-1.
Yeah.
On everything. And the only thing that kept the invasion back was the fact that Russia knew it would go nuclear. Russia just reached the point, I think 91, the first treaty or the second treaty, and by the third or fourth treaty, they realized that war was uneconomical, that they cut it down to 10,000 tanks. But the West, this is the funny part. Britain in the 50s thought the future was going to be missiles, but then switched to planes, whereas America built up planes and in the 70s and 80s realized that Russian missiles were too far ahead of them, and they started developing missiles. But you look at the cost of American development, $800 billion to show for what? Patriot and Minuteman, who are basically versions of Soviet technologies that they captured in Vietnam. And that's another reason why I think they want a war in Ukraine and why they want to prolong it. Each day is a step towards capturing something interesting they haven't seen before.
Honestly, something very interesting is I read with Klaus on war, and something he says is that when two countries or when two parties are at war, then you should expect both of them to give 100%. I just feel like neither side is giving 100%. So why is that? Is it because they do not want to win? Or is it because...
Yeah, Russia wants to win, but only with 40% of its forces.
Yeah, but that doesn't make sense. Militarily, politically, diplomatically, economically, it doesn't make sense. Russia has every interest in finishing this war as fast as possible, unless they're planning something else in correlation with it. And at the same time, something that has raised a lot of...
Western equipment. I think the plan is capturing Western equipment. I think they want the escalation to capture more Western equipment.
But the issue is whenever they send something new, like Leopard tanks, they remove all of the technologically advanced things that the Russians don't have from the tanks before they send them. So all the useless stuff is the ones that the Russians capture, and that of course they can still use some of that, but it's not worth continuing the war over it. I believe the most important thing to take into account here is the fact that in my title of the stream, I have said that I'm streaming until I have 80,000 subscribers. I currently have 79,320. So hurry it up, people. Please hit the subscribe button and let's see if we can hit it. So I think one of the most important parts to take notice about why they are extending this war is something that a lot of people have questioned, but not a lot of people have come with any answers to, and that is the Russian fortification of the coastline in Crimea. I believe that is very interesting because for whatever reason, the Russians are fortifying the coastline. That doesn't make sense because they are currently only at war with Ukraine. And Ukraine does not have any amphibious or naval capabilities, which means that they are preparing for someone who does. What is an enemy of Russia who has amphibious or naval capability in the Black Sea for them to fortify Crimea on the coast? NATO. That is the only possibility. That means that Russia is actively preparing to defend against NATO. Why is that? Like, no one would do that just because. A lot of the Western arguments for this is that the Russians said you have to build fortifications with this amount of money. So they built fortifications in Zaporizhia. Then they still had money extra, so they just built in Crimea. But that doesn't make sense. They would just build another line or a third line in Zaporizhia. Why build them in Crimea? Hello, Martin Dambach. Dambach or Dambach?
Dambach, yeah. So I'm from Germany. Okay. So following your YouTube channel. And so you are discussing quite technically issues. So you mentioned the war maybe could last 4 or 5 years. That would be a catastrophical scenario. Many people say it will not be a short war. Well, now we have a year. I can't imagine it will last longer than another year. So because maybe not running out of ammunition and weapons, but maybe running out of people who want to fight, especially in Ukraine. I mean, we should more talk about people who are able to fight, not traumatized and wounded or dead. So, so this war has to be stopped in near future.
I mean, I said one of the possibilities before to a trigger to end the war early would be a European uprising. We've seen the German protests. I mentioned them before in Berlin. They started a few hundred and they've reached a few thousand before the police stepped in. But I believe they could have easily reached more had people not been frightened off by a massive police presence. But next time you look at France, that France is devolving. They're going to have just so many internal problems that they won't be able to afford to go put another, not even $1 towards Ukraine.
I would agree. Europe is not in the mood of fighting this war many years.
Many are waking up.
People will not. Normal people like me, they will not. They will not join this war. They do not want to have this. In no way. So there will be pressure on Ukraine, a hard pressure to admit, a division of Ukraine maybe, or whatever. But it is not possible for Ukraine to recapture Crimea. If this is the goal, and then the war will be escalating more. And there is another problem. Stoltenberg and Sanna Marin recently said, oh, well, the long-term perspective is Ukraine will join NATO. That's what they said. So, and what is this? What does this mean? So Russia cannot accept this. So this is an absolute, there is no way out. If Europe doesn't step back, NATO...
It's 2 trains, 1 line. 2 trains, 1 line. They're going to crash.
So it's something very important to also say about Europe specifically is something that geopoliticians have been saying for decades now, and that is the demographical issue of we are seeing more and more older people and fewer younger people. And we still have pensions from, in France, they're sending it 2 years up from 62 to 64. And we are seeing these widespread protests start basically burning down Paris like they do every year. Or we should do it and make it a monthly thing by now. But it's essentially what we're seeing is that European countries, they're just all welfare states. And because of the demographical issue where we have more older people and fewer younger people, we have more people who need to receive and fewer people who actually give to the economy. And that is an issue because we have these welfare states where there's a lot of spending. We have very high taxes because there's a lot of spending that there needs to be covered. So if we have fewer people to tax, that means we have less money. That means we have less money to give to the welfare state. So essentially what we're seeing is that with this war that has given inflation, has stopped trade between Russia and Europe, which is a terrible thing for Europe, because Russia has a lot of natural resources. And what do you use natural resources for? Development, industry, and all of these things that give us money. So we have less workers and we have less industrial capacity. So that is two things that destroy our economy.
There's also something else you're missing. Russia's sitting on the Catherine the Great collection is worth $1.3 trillion. Now, China had the Imperial collection worth $3.2 trillion. That's estimated now to be halved because China has for 20 years been selling it off to build, the Ming vases and the Chinese collections. You see them on auctions. There was a Ming vase recently auctioned in Paris. China's been selling off its wealth to build its economy. Russia hasn't. America and a lot of American collections, particularly the so-called Democracy Endowment, they want that collection. It's the world's richest collection of jewels and diamonds ever in one place. There is that level of greed, I think, is driving the war at the highest levels. And I think Europeans are waking up. This is a World Economic Forum mess, but the World Economic Forum is made up of people who aren't Europeans. They don't live in Europe. They may visit Monaco, but that's about it. The only thing they know about Europe is it's a stopover.
Honestly, there's a lot of issues with this war other than, of course, there being a war in and of itself, because that's, of course, a terrible thing. But it's not just terrible for Ukraine, it's terrible for everyone involved in this conflict. And for whatever reason, us in the West have involved ourselves in it. And it is something, honestly, that really shocked me, is the amount of support there is for this war. Because although there are some people who see the reality of how terrible this war is, there's so many people who just don't put themselves in what is actually happening. They don't know what is happening. I go around talking with people in real life. I tell them about the war. They tell me, "Oh, is that still going on?" It's like they are not putting any thought into it, despite it costing thousands, hundreds of thousands of lives, and at the same time, it is costing us billions, trillions of dollars. It is destroying our relations with other countries. It is essentially pulling the whole world into a conflict. And that is something terrible, yet somehow the population is just not paying any attention to it. And it makes no sense to me that is the case, especially like every so often there comes a news article on the net or on the TV that's like, look at this terrible, terrible war crime by Russia. That is everything. That is the only thing that is being covered in television in Denmark, for example, but probably all of Europe. So, and the United States probably as well. So essentially, the general population is being fed this information of the only thing going on in this war is Russia is being evil and invading its neighbor Ukraine, just like Kamala Harris said it. It's like if that is the only information people have on this war, then they have extremely they're not understanding the severity of the situation. They don't understand how much is at stake here, and they are definitely not going to contribute to a good resolution.
Well, the narrative in Germany is quite simple. There is no other choice. Putin is Hitler, it's Putler, so we have to fight. There is no appeasement. There is not even one step of appeasement, because Russia will continue till Warsaw, Baltic states, Berlin, and completely silly, but that's the official narrative, and the people, a big amount of people is accepting that.
And that is a completely flawed argument, because at the very core of
it doesn't matter.
Yeah. But at the very core of it says...
The problem is, it's the media says, and people
quickly.
jump.
The narrative is, if Russia wins in Ukraine, they'll continue into NATO. But NATO will not intervene in this war, because then we'll be at war with Russia. It's a contradiction. If Ukraine loses, we're at war with Russia. But if Ukraine wins, we're at war with Russia.
Yeah, the argument you are... Yeah, sure, but that's the narrative, and the narrative is strong. And it's absolutely the majority, and even the Green Party in Germany is warmongering. They do not want to admit that European diplomacy failed horribly. In history books, in my opinion, it will be written like the biggest mistake in European diplomacy was to allow this war to happen. But you don't want to admit it, so you have to say Russia is the most evil thing ever possible, and Putin is the reincarnation of Hitler. So we cannot do diplomacy. We didn't fail in diplomacy. We couldn't do it. That's it. We have to fight whatever to the end, whatever this end is. So if Europe and NATO and the US do not step back, it will escalate to whatever point we can imagine.
Well, this is equivalent to... Yesterday was equivalent to the US walking out of the 1924 Paris Peace Accord, when China offered a immediate ceasefire. The US said no, without even looking at the terms and conditions. They said no. Any ceasefire would be a smile on Putin's face, and we cannot accept that, because Putin will just take the territory he's got. Well, you're not going to take 1 inch of territory off him. Not anywhere Russian blood has been spilt, it's not going to be given back. It's Russian territory. And the thing that people forget is it used to be Russian territory until the mistake of, I think, what was it, 1958, when Khrushchev decided that in order to denationalize nations, they would mix up their borders.
I don't know the historical details about this.
Historical foundations. Yeah, the historical foundations go back to the secret wars during the Cold Wars, where you had uprisings in Eastern Europe against Soviet occupation funded by the US. There are so many things that people are unaware of that contributed to the Ukraine war, like how a handful of neocons in the West can fund a revolution after revolution. And I think even Germany's asking themselves, what did Barack Obama ask Angela Merkel when she was doing the Minsk Accord? Was this war founded back then? Because she came out and said, no, we never intended for peace. I don't know if it's been on the German news or not, but Merkel and Hollande both admitted that the Minsk Accords were fake. It was
they were just going by time.
Ukraine.
Honestly, I think the simplest,
Sorry, Martin, I haven't heard a reaction from Germany.
The simplest thing to talk about is if we look at this world map behind me, right there. To all the Americans who don't know geography, that is Ukraine, that is Russia, that is United States. What are they doing here? I think that's the simplest argument to make. What is the United States doing in Ukraine?
The simplest argument is in 1948 when you signed the UN Charter, you agreed not to cease any and all interference in other countries. You haven't stopped.
And at the same time,
you are asking questions.
Honestly, asking questions is the most dangerous thing in the West. I think that's probably why we're not seeing a lot of people actually know a lot about this, because everyone on the media is like, oh, this is what is happening. Like, I know someone who wrote a lot of articles about the war in Ukraine. I think 3 articles. And he was essentially saying to the Danish government, please explain what we are doing in Ukraine. There's no political, there's no economical incentive to do anything. There's no reason for us to be in Ukraine. What are you doing in Ukraine? It doesn't make sense.
I can give you an answer. I mean, I can play the Advocatus Diaboli, and it was stated on Twitter by NATO official line. There are epic things going on in Ukraine. It's like Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter and Star Wars. That is the official tweet from NATO on Twitter. I was just embarrassed about it. So what we are fighting is that's the official. That's what they say. We are fighting the good ones. The good ones in the Western world are fighting.
We're fighting the bad guys
to enforce the moral and the justice and against the ugly guys. So that's the narrative, and this reason is enough that the American is fighting in Ukraine. That's it.
Yeah.
That's the official.
I'm not sure.
You can argue against it, of course, and disagree, but that's the official saying.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it was India or China who asked did you reject the deal because it came from Russia? This was the first peace accord, and then they asked did you reject the second ceasefire because it came from China? Are you going to reject are you going to now sanction us because we won't sanction? Yeah, I think it was India who said, oh, well, now will you sanction us because we won't sanction them? Because if we sanction them, we'll go the same way of Western Europe. We'll have 10% inflation within a month.
Honestly, economically, India has won from this war because they have gotten discounts on Russian oil, and then they just sell it to the West at a much higher price. And the West is like, this is Russian oil, but it's not Russia, so it's good to go.
Saudi Arabia now powers its ships with Russian diesel at 13 cents cheaper than the world price.
Mm-hmm.
And if you know how much diesel a ship uses per day, you'll see millions of dollars in savings per day, just from 13 cents discount.
If we assume that maybe at some point there will be a sort of peace or not shooting anymore at some point, then war still will go on if Europe and NATO is continuing its track. So there will be partisan war or whatever kind of low-level war. There will be, to answer your questions, what happens next. So even if there is a fire pause or whatever, then war will continue probably, except Russia, I don't know, changes completely and joins NATO, but I don't know.
Well, 2010, the world missed a glorious opportunity. In 2010, Putin offered to join NATO and create what's called the Red Line. The Red Line would be a neutral barrier between China and Russia, and China would militarily and Russia would not militarily occupy either territory. That would be in like a neutral zone monitored by Europe. Russia would guarantee every former state absolutely never again, we'll never again occupy you unless you go to war against us. And NATO would have had its Ukraine, you know. If Ukraine is that important, why did they reject the deal? I think the deal was always war.
Also, something to note is that Zelensky's arguments against talking peace talks with Russia is that Russia invaded Ukraine in the first place, so how can they trust them not to invade again? Well, I would argue that the guarantee you have is the fact that from 1990 until today, until 24th of February, Russia didn't invade Ukraine. So what changed at that time? It is, first of all, the Ukrainians didn't want to make peace with the Donbass. They didn't want to agree to the Minsk agreements, all of these things. And the second thing is that they kept wanting to join NATO, which Russia has stated since 2008, I believe, that is beyond any red lines Russia has. They will go to war over
unless
that.
they joined, unless it was Russia. 2010, they offered said, "Yep, you can do it, but we have to join as well." And there would be this huge barrier you cannot cross. You cannot add these countries. You cannot, you cannot use us to isolate China. And I think 2014. I think from then on, 2010, to 2012, they started formulating a plan. 2014, they put it into action to create war and to increase tensions slowly over time. Because it wasn't just not peace with Donbass, it was training the Ukrainian army, it was flooding with Western weapons, it was setting up F-16 training bases in Germany, Poland, and Romania. It was setting up forward bases for the 101st Airborne Marine Reactionary Unit. Those are the first strike units. They were in Moldavia. There's a whole number of things that don't get reported by the Western media that have slowly trickled out that say there were 300,000 troops. What were they doing on the Russian border a week before Russia started escalating their troops on the border?
Hello, Sam, and welcome to the stream.
Again, you have an active war against Germany.
Hi.
And Germany hasn't reacted.
Well, Germany did react.
Sam looks.
I believe the German.
Dangerous.
I believe the German foreign minister, or whatever her name is, said in the parliament, "We are at war with Russia." And then the Russians asked, "What do you mean by that?" And they're like, "This is Russian propaganda."
Oh, she literally said that on national television as well.
In the middle of parliament on national television, we are at war with Russia. I don't understand how the narrative still goes on when there are so many contradictories on a day-to-day basis.
It also has to do with how far people are willing to search for the truth and the people's inability to critically think about the situation and look for look at what's being told and look at what's what are the lies and what you have to differentiate between the truth and what isn't the truth.
I think people just want to hear the most comfortable truth, or the most comfortable lie, rather than the truth, because they know that the truth would completely destroy everything they believe in. So just going with the comfortable lie, no matter how absurd it is much easier for them, so they don't want to think more about it.
Like the agreement in 91 not to expand NATO.
Yeah.
I forget the accord, but they were supposed to meet for a nuclear disarmament talks. Now you can blame Trump for that, but you can also blame the deep state. They told Trump that Russia was developing new weapons in violation of the agreement. Now, instead of including those new weapons and saying, "Hey, we want to inspect these," what happens? War in Ukraine, shut down inspectors. Now, it does turn out that Russia is now deploying new missiles and that. But until 6 months ago, Russia had not deployed new weapons. So there's another peace opportunity, another inspection opportunity. I think this is all pre-set out that Biden hopes. Like, you remember the early days of World War One, Britain only had 14 pounders, and they managed to scale up their arms industry. At the start of World War II, America started with a large navy that they'd been building since 1936. What a coincidence. Now, this time we're starting a war in Ukraine, and America's starting off with what? The second largest air force in the world. And they have over 500 B-52s sitting in the Nevada desert, which were supposed to be destroyed under arms control treaties, which are now null and void.
I have a question. I want to raise a question. So what is the belief, how long can Ukraine provide this war with soldiers, with motivated and trained soldiers? So the basic situation is Russia is firing factor 7, 8, 9 the amount of ammunition than Ukraine does. And so that's a mathematical question. How many soldiers does Ukraine will have in 1 month, in 6 months, in 1 year? So that's a question I'm asking. You have to know Web Union. You are you are doing so much detailed stuff about
Actually,
this.
I think it is very
I know history
difficult. Yeah, I know history lesson said one, but I think this is a very difficult question that cannot be solved with just math, because we have to take tactics into consideration. How many people are fighting? How many people are surrendering? How many people are actually running away from the battlefield? How many are actually getting hit by every shell? There can be 100 shells without a single casualty. There can be one shell with 10 casualties. So it's very difficult because we do not have any idea of exactly how much it is, because everyone is only interested in sending out the best possible video evidence they can of the situation.
Okay.
Whenever we see evidence from Russia, it is a single Russian shell killing 10 Ukrainian soldiers, and then it's like this only happens like every 1,000 shells or something like that. But they are trying to make it as if it happens every time. And the same with the Ukrainians. Every time they send out a video, it's of 5 Russian soldiers getting hit and then they're running away and all of this stuff. So they nitpick and cherry pick everything that looks good on the resume. But from that, we can determine, okay, how much video are we getting from the different sites and all of these things. But at that time, we can also see that there's a lot of issues, because, for example, the Russian soldier, not the Wagner, not the DPR, LPR, not the Chechens and all of those guys, the normal Russian army soldier does not bring their phone to the front line. They do not. They don't have it. They have some GoPro cameras, some of them, very few, and from those we can see some active combat footage. But most do not have anything to show. That means we can have 100,000 Ukrainian casualties. I'm just throwing a random number. We can have 100,000 Ukrainian casualties that is completely undocumented. But then we have the 10,000 that is documented. And then everyone's going to be saying, okay, we estimate 50,000. Well, that could still be 50,000 below what is their reality. And it could also be something way above if everything is being documented. There's no details on this. There's a huge gray zone. So that is why I always avoid talking about casualties. I'll say History Legends gets close, but I think that is still a very wild guess. It could be completely wrong, and it could be right on the money.
So there's always going to be a level.
Sorry, Sam.
There's always going to be a certain level, like, of. No, I completely forgot. You can go.
All right. I think we're getting there. There's going to be mistakes made on both sides on the count. Also saying that there's also foreign fighters, like Russia has the Chechens, which add another 50,000 plus another 50,000 from Wagner, whereas Ukraine, they have 50,000 Poles, 5,000 to 15,000 Romanians, depending on the source, and another 50,000 in miscellaneous foreign troops, which may or may not include Syrians. But we also have possibility of up to drawing on. This is what they can draw on: 1 million Chinese, 1 million North Koreans, and that will tilt NATO into full panic mode. But if NATO keeps adding to the war, Russia will have to do something to make sure they don't lose territory and stalemate them. And Russia's redefined war, and this is why the West, I think, wants to prolong it, because Russia is coming up with new anti-drone technologies. Russia is coming up with new drone technologies. Russian anti-tank missiles have taken out the so-called Challenger tanks. I think they lost 2 in Bakhmut, but this is unconfirmed. The Challengers are supposed to take between 3 to 5 artillery strikes from a 120 millimeter within 100 meters before penetration. These were the, those, they call them Sidewinders. You may have seen them on the news, the spinning missile. They look like a Sidewinder snake spinning through. They've taken out 2 Challengers, possibly in Bakhmut. But another thing we're getting is that we're starting to notice that whenever they talk about Western deliveries, you suddenly see them on the front lines and then they disappear again. And then you hear another. But so there's this disconnect that people are starting to wake up and realize that Russia's destroying a lot of equipment. And they're doing it very quickly and very efficiently.
That's the thing.
So
about the equipment.
6 months
there's a lot of
to 4 years.
The announcements of equipment is so far off reality, but I'm not exactly sure how far off, because they have announced like this and that much of this and that. But if that was the reality, then Ukraine would have run out of ammunition. They would have run out of tanks ages ago. If you look at the official Ukrainian Ministry of Defense numbers, Ukraine hasn't lost anything, then so it would make sense. If you look at the Russian Ministry of Defense numbers, Ukraine should be out of tanks and ammunition months ago. So it makes no sense either way, because the numbers given by both sides is completely false, and they're the ones who have the actual numbers. And at the same time, even if they did give real numbers, that is also false numbers, because we have seen from historical sources from World War II, where, for example, in a single battle between Japanese fighters and United States fighters, the United States shot down 4 Japanese planes and claimed they shot down 16, and the Japanese shot down, it's the opposite. The Japanese shot down 4 American planes and said they shot down 12, and the Americans shot down 5 Japanese planes and claimed they shot down 15. So that is like 4 to 5 times, 3 to 4 times as much as they claim. So it makes no sense that the rate is actual reality, because we all relying on people's eyes, and people's eyes lie. They do actually lie, because throughout all the adrenaline, all of the stress, and all of these things, you want to imagine things, or you end up hallucinating, or you believe, like, if you shoot someone, how do you know they are dead? If you just shoot someone 300 meters away and then you fall back.
The same plane. This has happened in World War II. So how many times did the same people claim they've shot down the same plane?
Exactly, that as well. So there's so many things that just all add up to any number being completely false, even if you have the official information on that. So trying to guess how many casualties there are is completely ridiculous. But I can tell you one thing, and that is no actual casualty number of any war in history is ever accurate. None. There's not a single one. And that is because every single one has these issues. We can say, okay, what if a battle between 100 men and 10 men, and the 100 men killed the 10 men? Okay, then, sure, I'll give it to you. All 10 men died. But then in the historical records, it's 100 men against 100 men, and the 100 men who actually were 100 men, and the 10 men who were actually 10 men, suddenly the 10 men are 100 casualties, and that is what's written in the books.
I think that with the Battle of Amsterdam, where the last of the Spanish army was down to like 1,000 or something, but the Dutch said they killed 100,000 Spanish.
Exactly. So, like, there are these absurd claims in history. I could go on a video tomorrow, claim on that video the Russians have lost 200,000 men and the Ukrainians have lost 1 million men, and come with no documents or anything. Or I could, for example, go to Ukraine, spend a week there, is drinking some coffee at some cafe in Lviv, and then go back and say, okay, I've been in Ukraine, the Ukrainians have lost this and that, the Russians have lost this and that'll be an official source in 100 years. And then people learning history in 100 years will say, okay, the Ukrainians lost 1 million, the Russians lost 200,000. And I'm just pulling that out of my ass.
But the secret services of the USA, of Great Britain, they must have hidden data, which not must be accurate, but which are close to reality. They must have this data, but they do not tell us, of course. And why not? So that does make me angry, because the public in Europe or in the Western world is not able to make a profound discussion and to make a decision based on
decision. Yes.
So we have no idea about the capability of Ukraine to regain lost territory. We know nothing. So, this is shit.
Well, let's see. 2/3 of Europe were according to polls, 2/3 of Europe didn't even know Donbass used to be part of Russia. They didn't know the demographics. They didn't know the elections. They didn't know. A lot of Europeans didn't even know about the 2014 coup. But then van der Leyen comes out and she says, and this was now 6 months ago, when she said 155,000 were killed.
Yeah, I would disagree. The people know about the coup at Maidan. Everybody knows in Germany. But the narrative is it was a democratic sort of revolution. People wanted to get freedom, wanted to join the EU. And so there was some violence, but this is collateral damage every time it happens. So people know, but they evaluate it in a different way. So
that might be why they said 2/3 seem to be unaware of the actual that it was actually CIA, not that it was a group out of America flowing into Ukraine through the training the NATO training programs, and through Open Society Foundation. They all came in. Some of them were Americans out of uniform. That's illegal.
Yeah. Something very interesting is the fact that if we look at the current situation, words are very powerful. There was an interview with Zlatan Ibrahimovic. I believe he is the very famous Swedish football player. And they were asking him about his trip to Qatar during the World Cup. And then they asked him, what do you think of your trip to Qatar? Then he said it was 10 out of 10. It was great, good service, good food, everything was great. And then a lot of people in the Western debate and all of these things, they keep saying Ibrahimovic loves the Qatari dictatorship. First of all, it's a constitutional monarchy. It's not a dictatorship. But words in the West is very powerful. They say dictatorship, then they put it in the same category as North Korea or as the United States.
The 1930s.
That was a joke.
The 1930s.
But basically what I'm saying is that the West's media is very powerful and controls public opinion with a very tight fist.
Yes.
And I think I'm going to end off this stream with that because I have more things to do. And
was it Tucker or Waters?
About what?
They did a comparison of the media narrative between the Iraq War and the Ukraine War, and how the anti-war movement has completely disappeared from the Western media compared to the Iraq War.
Also, like the Vietnam War, basically every war in American history has had a lot of anti-war protesters. This is probably the first one where everyone is just happy and go for it. Makes no sense. Like actually, the media control has evolved drastically.
There was one small lone voice that was against it. Yes, Scott Ritter, Colonel Douglas McGregor. Who else? I'm trying to think. There was a few voices. Tulsi Gabbard, not many.
Not many, but I guess it's a start for anti-war,
Yeah.
but who knows?
But,
Yeah.
yeah.
All right, that
But
is
they're not the
all
traditional
for this
anti-war
stream.
left.
I'm gonna
Yeah.
end off now.
Okay.
Thank you all for coming to this debate, and I'm hoping if I do this again that I'll give you everyone a larger head up so that you can prepare and all of these things. But thank you all for coming on the show for on such a short notice. So thank you for coming, and to everyone who came to the stream, thank you all for coming to the stream. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all next time.
Ciao.